Today on The State of Us, Russia's invasion of Ukraine impacts both North Korea and the Iran nuclear deal. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the one and only, the senior resident historian here at True Chat, an educator of more than 35 years, and the friendly redneck liberal himself, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. Today, as tanks smolder, a Russian retreat leaves Kyiv quiet, and Putin is reminding the West that he has economic weapons as well, according to the New York Times. We'll also be looking at, from the Wall Street Journal, how North Korea now has a bigger missile and the U.S. has fewer options. This is tied in directly to a lot of what is happening with Russia. And another item impacted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the Iran nuclear deal nears completion, but our friends in Russia are posing quite the complication. So we've got a lot to get through today, a lot of secondary impacts of the Russia invasion of Ukraine. But before we get to all of that, Lance, do we have a word of the day?
The word of the day is recalcitrant. 4 syllables. It is an adjective spelled recalcitrant. And it means refusing to obey authority, custom, or regulation, stubbornly defiant. And we're going to talk about multiple recalcitrant countries and individuals, I think, in today's show. Also means hard to handle or deal with. You've got Russia, Iran, North Korea. A lot of recalcitrant individuals.
Recalcitrant. Okay. I don't think I've heard that before, so that's a good one today. We'll see how many of our listeners are able to use it.
I've heard from a couple listeners that when they're in their conversations following them listening to the show, they try to put the word of the day in their conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Try to insert those.
They do. Yeah. So there are people that are following this and broadening their horizons.
So as tanks are smoldering, a Russian retreat leaves Kyiv quiet. So for those that aren't up to speed, in recent days, Russian forces that were intent on originally overwhelming Kyiv with tanks and artillery when the war started have retreated under fire across a broad front by Saturday, leaving behind them dead soldiers and burned vehicles, according to witnesses, Ukrainian officials, satellite images, and military analysts. So it sounds like good news. However, I think it's very important we mention, Lance, right, that there's a number of analysts who think this could just be a false retreat, right? In other words, they're not actually retreating, they're regrouping and trading out some troops for fresh ones and getting ready possibly to hit harder. Obviously, nobody knows for sure other than Putin and his inner circle. So we don't have a lot of details to say one way or the other. I guess it's as the doctors say, Lance, right? Cautious optimism. Cautious optimism is what perhaps we should have in regards to this. Wonderful that Kyiv is not directly under a threat by Russian invasion right now. Obviously, though, it doesn't mean it'll stay that way. I think part of what we've talked about in the last couple of days is Lance and I have observed that, the media is debating how interested to continue to stay in Ukraine. And we don't want our listeners to forget that there is, in fact, still a war going on in Ukraine. People are dying every day. Lots of civilians have already been killed. There's a host of potential war crimes that have been unearthed, which I don't think should shock anybody. I mean, shouldn't surprise us, I guess I should say, that this has probably occurred. However, it's a reminder that this is a war and Russia is continuing their aggression and Ukraine is not safe. And we still have plenty more that we could be doing.
Well, there's no movement unless something dramatic happens in any kind of peace talk. And Putin's trying, in my opinion, trying to save face, going to move the troops to a region where he's had some successes in this war and attack there and take what he can. And if you look at the pictures, okay, Kiev wasn't taken over, but who's going to help rebuild it? And as far as the atrocities, war itself is an atrocity. What did people think was going to happen when missiles were fired and tanks were brought in and there's war? Buildings are destroyed and innocent people are killed. That's why we need to stop this war. People act like, oh my gosh, look at what's happening over here in Ukraine because of this war. What did you think happened in war? I'm amazed sometimes at the ignorance of people. And you look up the word ignorance, okay? I'm not calling you a name, but it means that you're unaware of what happens in a war. I mean, has it been so long since we've been involved in a war? Do we not know what happened to our soldiers when they were over fighting in the Middle East? Isn't that why we ended that and brought them home? Because we were tired of watching what was happening to them? Aren't those atrocities war crimes? They're crimes against people, against humans. It's not normal for what happened to our soldiers over in the Middle East who were trying to do good things. So there you have it. It's not over. We're going to see it again, and I think we're going to see even more, and we're going to be put on the burner of how much are we going to get involved? How much are we going to let this go on? And I guess if you quit talking about it and you turn your head and you don't see it and bury your head in the sand, then you don't have to face it.
One of the items about how much should we be doing is an item that I don't think that we've greatly discussed. We've talked about the sanctions, the impact they're going to have, sanctions like the world has never seen, which generally speaking that is true. However, there was this good piece in the Sunday edition of the New York Times that I'm not sure, Lance, most people understand just how much Russia still is getting, though. Okay.
Well, sanctions, right? Sanctions. We're gonna get them with sanctions, except for oil because, well, Europe needs oil.
That's right. The European Union gets 40% of its gas and a quarter of its oil from Russia. A cutoff from one day to the next, according to the current chancellor of Germany, would plunge, quote, our country and the whole of Europe into a recession. And you might say, well, what is the economic impact of 40% of gas and a quarter of oil? Well, Europe's ongoing energy purchases, according to this article in the New York Times, send as much as $850 million each day. Did you get that, Lance? $850 million a day into Russia's coffers, according to an economic institute in Brussels. That money helps Russia to fund its war efforts and blunts the impact of other sanctions. Because of soaring energy prices, gas export revenues from the Russia energy giant injected $9.3 billion into the country's economy in March alone, according to an estimate by Oxford Economics, a global advisory firm.
Well, I'm stuck back at the 40% because to me, and this may be wrong, so you can correct me with my economics here, but if we get 40% of oil from a certain place and we don't get it, basically then gas prices are going to double just on the law of supply and demand. So, instead of looking at $4 to $5 a gallon gasoline at the pump, we'd be looking at $8 to $10 a gallon if we were in the situation that Europe's in. Now, to your point of the article, the United States is not dependent on Russian oil to the amount that the European Union is. But that's that's what's going to happen in Europe. That is the comparison of what would be going on here in the United States if we depended on Russian oil as much as the European Union, our allies, depend on Russian oil. So yes, lots of money going to Russia from the Europeans for oil. And also Putin is making a claim that he wants paid in rubles, the Russian currency that has been taking a hit, but he wants paid in rubles so that he can bolster that economy and stop the recession that's going on in his own country, because while he's fighting this war, he's also taking things from his own people and they are suffering. But, you know, the Russians historically have suffered for the good of Mother Russia, and that's what Putin is counting on. But at the same time, he needs an influx of money so that he can placate his folks a little bit so that they will continue to support him and the war effort.
Yeah, the article actually points out, Lance, that Mr. Putin's demand that gas purchases be made in rubles looked like another one of those interventions. Still, the insistence was puzzling. Russia could just as easily take the ongoing influx of euros and dollars paid by foreign governments and convert them to rubles. So why do it? Well, Mr. Putin, of course, may revel in putting European governments in an uncomfortable position and flexing his power. But his demands may also reflect difficulties at home. And that is further reflected in there's consequences to things like this, right? Long-term consequences to Russia. One of those, according to David L. Goodwin, who served as the State Department Special Envoy on Energy in the Obama administration, he said they, referring to Europe, are done with Russian gas. I think even if this war would end, and even if you had a new government in Russia, I think there's no going back.
Well, I disagree. I mean, as soon as this is over, if and when it's over 10 years from now, they'll be buying gas from Russia.
Well, I think, remember, Europe is arguably in front of the rest of the world in their move toward more renewable forms of energy. And maybe this accelerates that. Simply because they don't want to be in this situation where they rely. I mean, I wouldn't. I would be terribly uncomfortable as a European, knowing that you are just. I mean, you're literally beholden to Russia to make sure that your home stays heated.
But they were before the war, right?
Right.
Well, didn't they know what Putin was?
Well, no.
Yes, they did.
Well,
yes, they did.
Maybe they should have.
And they looked the other way because they could get cheap oil. All right. And they're not, yes, they are further along than the United States, but they are not willing. I mean, there's even talk of bringing coal in and into Great Britain because they don't know how they're going to survive next winter. Right. And this is the far reaching effects. All right. We're all thinking about, well, let's get warm and do summer. And in Europe, they're worried about what's going to happen in the winter when it gets cold again. We don't have enough fuel. We don't have enough renewable energy to keep people warm.
The expectation is that renewable energy globally is going to retract and expand all at the same time. And you might say, well, that sounds impossible. Well, again, as we're talking about this, hopefully you can draw some of the parallels as to why that might be the case. So that's kind of an update on what's going on specifically with Russia and Ukraine, and also the potential direct economic impact that Putin could have on European countries. But let's talk a little bit more about North Korea and Iran, because these are two that you may not have heard much about recently, but things are still going on there. And what's happened with Russia invading Ukraine is definitely having an impact on them. And we're going to look at that. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. North Korea's 2017 ICBM launch, with an estimated range far enough to reach the U.S. mainland, was seen as clearly out of bounds, even in the eyes of its close allies in Beijing and Moscow, according to the Wall Street Journal. The long-range test resulted in caps to North Korea's fuel imports and a repatriation of overseas laborers who earned foreign currency for the regime. The invasion of Ukraine has left little room for agreement at the United Nations among the world's major powers.
I mean, we'll talk about North Korea and Kim Jong-un. This is the picture that's next to the word recalcitrant. I mean, he is a very recalcitrant individual. I mean, he is taking this opportunity because of the situation in Ukraine to further embolden his intercontinental ballistic missile power in his country. So this is kind of a periphery problem, right? That's being caused by the war in Ukraine. With that, with the United States and the European Union and NATO all focusing on Ukraine, Kim Jong-un is saying, well, I'm going to up my nuclear power and my missiles. And it's also a change in the government in South Korea. So he's flexing his muscles to show the incoming government in South Korea, don't mess with me. Don't talk about bringing these two countries together. Don't talk about taking me out of power.
Not only, right, is it unlikely that you're going to get China, Russia, and the United States on the same page right now to do anything about North Korea. So a UN Security Council type resolution, very unlikely, if not straight out impossible. But then the article points out this other component, which I think is another sort of secondary effect, right? North Korea's 38-year-old third-generation dictator is likely to be taking lessons from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, from the deterrence that is wielded by Moscow because it possesses nuclear weapons to the vulnerability of Kyiv after surrendering them. Close Pyongyang watchers say. But Mr. Kim is also closely monitoring what counter moves the U.S. and its allies can summon against Russia. So you've got Putin, right, who we know is a very recalcitrant individual, and you've got Kim Jong-un, who is looking to secure his place on the world stage, right? And Putin's kind of doing his jockeying to try to get his power, right? And say Russia's still great and Russia can still be a pain in the butt. And I mean, if you're Kim Jong-un, you're seeing that succeed. I mean, to an extent. Is it going as spectacularly as Putin wanted? No, I mean, it's definitely not, right? However, you're seeing, for the most part, what happens is sanctions. And if you're North Korea, well, you've been being sanctioned for how long? 80 years? I mean, so, you know, like what exactly do you have to lose?
Well, and he also has a starving population, always has, because of the sanctions and everything else. Plus, the year 2020 was rough on them because COVID-19 stopped some of China's trade with North Korea because the North Koreans wanted to seal off their border. And so trade faltered and floods wiped out crop production. So, you know, what do you do when you can't feed your people and you take care of them? Well, you scare them to death. And so Kim Jong-un says we need these nukes to protect us from the U.S. imperialists who are going to take over our country. And so people can say, yeah, I can go to bed hungry because I know my government's protecting me from the U.S. invasion. Well, the U.S. has no desire to invade North Korea. There's nothing there that we want. But this is a ploy not only to put North Korea's name back into the picture because they can get away with it, but it's also a ploy, I believe, for Kim Jong-un to make it easier to solidify his dictatorship and stay in power because he can show his people, look at these big missiles we have, and we're going to protect you from the South Koreans and the United States coming in and taking us over.
Part of what I think we've tried to highlight for years, Lance, right, is people should not assume that the populations at large of Russia and North Korea are all recalcitrant and they just are like, nah, we've got the greatest leaders that ever existed and nobody can tell us otherwise. There is nobody telling them otherwise, right? I mean, I think it's so important to keep that in mind because it's easy to get upset and be like, oh, Russians, they should take a stand and these North Koreans, they ought to stand up and overthrow their leader. And it's like, to Lance's point, North Koreans have been starving for decades, right? I mean, and they've been scared of their government for decades. And there's many of them that have tried to escape for decades. So like this is for many of them, like if you're my age and you live in North Korea, you've never known anything different. There are many Russians who have never known a leader that wasn't Vladimir Putin. Right? I mean, that's all they've ever known. So how it's that whole, you can't ask people to know what they don't know just by like, well, they ought to know. Well, how? There's state-controlled media, crackdown across social media and digital media, and you've lived under the same type of leadership pretty much your whole life.
And the tie-in, as we've tried to make here to Ukraine, is that Kim Jong-un feels emboldened to work on his nuclear power because of what he's seeing play out in Ukraine towards how people are functioning with Putin, but also because there's no way, the sanctions he received were because Russia, China, and the United States got on the same page, and there's no way that's going to happen. So, when you say, well, North Korea, what, well, here's another advance in nuclear weapons because of what's going on in Ukraine. So you have Russia and their nuclear weapons, and now you have the North Koreans, albeit not in the same league, but working to get there because of the war in Ukraine. So there are outlier issues that are developing in the world while we continue to watch this war continue.
So the other question then becomes, well, what can we do about North Korea? Is there anything? And I think, unfortunately, the answer ties back to something that Lance and I have said before, which is you got to draw the line in the sand for Russia. Because at the moment, I mean, your people are already starving in North Korea, right? You're Kim Jong-un. Your people are already starving. They're already hurting. Your economy's already sucky. I guess you can try to hurt us some more, but Russia and China aren't going to help you do that, which was really the only deterrent previously.
Well, those are the big trading partners. If the U.S. doesn't trade with North Korea, so we can put all the sanctions we on them that we want, doesn't do any good. That's why it was so important back in 2017 to get the Russians and the Chinese on board, and we did. And now that's not in existence. So to your point, it's well taken. The only way to stop this recalcitrant individual and country is to go back and stop Russia. Because then if you stop Russia, then you can have some people jump in and help you stop the North Koreans, who have more control and more power over them than we do.
Most individuals and nations in history that were recalcitrant, the way that you address them is not by attempting to appease them, right? They respond to power, they respond to force, and pending our willingness to use military might in North Korea, which I don't even think has been discussed anytime recently, or at least to any serious degree, pending that, we're not likely to get anywhere. The other thing, Lance, is I would just point out, as a historical component, the Korean War, right? And what happened when we weren't willing to go all the way? Well, what happened? You have a divided Korea, a North and a South Korea. You have a democracy and you have a dictatorship. And the dictatorship has developed nuclear weapons capable of striking the United States. That's what happened when we didn't get the job finished.
We thought during the Cold War, we wouldn't live to see the year 2000, that we would annihilate ourselves with nuclear weapons. The reason for, in your words, of not completing the job, air quotes there, in Korea was because of the fear that to do so would cause a nuclear war, which at that time was believed to be what was going to end the world as we knew it. And you could also say there was consternation at the end of World War II because Harry S. Truman, the American president, would not go into China and take out the communists there when we had everything in Europe. And that's, Douglas MacArthur and some of those people were asking for that. And MacArthur asked to go into China and North Korea, and Truman said no. And then Eisenhower took over and said, came in and said, not only are we not going to go into China and expand this Cold War into a hot war, we're going to negotiate a peace and bring our boys home by Christmas.
Iran, what do they have to do with Russia and North Korea? Well, again, something else not getting a lot of attention, but maybe you've heard, maybe you haven't, that close to a new nuclear deal with Iran. You say, what? But there's some holdups. What are those holdups?
There's that N word, nuclear, right?
Nuclear.
What
are those holdups? Well, we're going to talk about it. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. The Iran nuclear deal is near completion, but Russia is posing complications. Oh, big surprise. Big surprise. That's the theme of today's show, is recalcitrant individuals and nations, of which it should be no surprise that Putin's Russia is mentioned as part of that list, and complicating issues not only with North Korea, but also with Iran. And guess what? Both of these places are where we're talking about, what is it? Lance said the key word before the break: nuclear. Nuclear.
And
that's what we got to worry about.
You say, well, why? Well, if you remember, the United States under President Trump pulled out of this Iran deal, that, we didn't want to have any part of it. So now we have to depend on Russia and the European countries to enforce it as we try to work our way back into this. And you say, well, why is this important? Because Iran is believed to be only have several weeks from having enough uranium to create a nuclear bomb. That's what we were afraid of in the beginning. Okay?
What's Russia got to do with this, though?
Well, Russia's part of the group, along with the United States originally, who went to Iran and says, you can't have uranium empowered to build nuclear weapons. You can have enough to run a nuclear reactor for power, but you can't have enough enriched uranium to create a nuclear bomb. Well, Russia's one of the countries. Iran, the current members of the deal are Iran, China, Russia, Britain, France, Germany, and the European Union. Notice I didn't mention the United States because
we're not currently part of it.
We pulled out of the deal in 2018.
And Iran has regularly denied intending to build a nuclear weapon, but it has enriched uranium to 60%. That's a level that has no civilian use. And it has created uranium metal that would be required in order to build a bomb, again, with no practical civilian use. The New Deal would sharply restrict Iran's nuclear program and allow it to sell its oil freely on the world market at a critical moment when the war in Ukraine has threatened supplies. But to get there, the Iranians are insisting that President Biden lift one of the terrorism designations of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, senior European officials say. The Corps was declared, quote, a foreign terrorist organization, end quote, by the United States in April of 2019, nearly a year after President Donald J. Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. And any removal of that designation would face sharp criticism in Congress. We had covered that, obviously, that Islamic Revolutionary Guard and the atrocities perpetrated by them on behalf of the government. So Iran is saying, in order to do this, we want you to not call them a, foreign terrorist organization. And the United States is like, yeah, I don't think that's on the table, because they are.
But you say, why do we care? Well, if we sign this deal with Iran, then there is no reason to carry on some of the sanctions, and then possibly Iranian oil could be sent to the European Union to replace some of what's been lost or could be lost coming from Russia that we talked about earlier in the show. But now what a tangled web we weave, right? When we begin to practice to deceive, in this case, to not get involved further in the war in Ukraine, we now have Iran who we are trying to negotiate with so that we can get access to their oil. But unfortunately, one of the people that are in control with any negotiations with Iran on their nuclear weapons happens to be Russia, who would be hurt if there was some kind of deal signed, because then the Iranian government could start to replace the Russian oil with their own. So now how do you negotiate with a country like Iran, who's not a very nice country, right? I mean, the only time I was willing, besides now, to possibly go and fight was when I was a freshman in college And the Iranian government of Ayatollah Khomeini took Americans hostage. Came home from school, said, I'm ready to join the military and go fight. And my mom looked at me with wild eyes and she goes, you don't believe in that kind of stuff. I said, well, nobody messes with Americans. Nobody messes with us anywhere in the world. And by God, I'm going to go over there and take out some Iranians. And now here we are trying to negotiate with them on a nuclear arms deal that we had pulled out of because we want to get some of their oil to help our European allies not be so dependent on Russia, except who's in charge of this deal right now because we pulled out of it? Russia. I don't know. Can you explain that? I mean, I'm like, really?
Well, and not that history repeats itself or anything, but further complicating the possibility of a deal is that there are several Americans being held by Iran, several American citizens.
Now. Yeah, currently.
Right now.
Yeah.
So that makes it additionally complicated.
To your point of that American, in the last segment of the American government personnel who said, well, we're not going to see Europe ever buy Russian oil again. What? Now we're trying to make a deal with Iran to buy Iranian oil? Yeah. Anyway. All right. I think I make my point. Getting frustrated.
Yeah.
But it's all tied around to the war in Ukraine.
Right.
And that's our point today,
because
right? This war in Ukraine is a bigger thing around the world and affects the United States in many different areas. It's just not, should we help the people of Ukraine who want a democracy and have a democracy from a ruthless dictator taking them over? Should we help them? It's not just that question, but it's look at all these other things. Because of the war in Ukraine, North Korea is enlarging its nuclear capabilities because
unchecked.
Right. And because of the war in Ukraine, we are trying to negotiate a deal with the Iranians in a treaty that we pulled out of less than 5 years ago, because we need the Iranians, who used to be public enemy number one in the United States when I was growing up, so we can get their oil to stop money flowing into Russia and Putin, which he can then use to continue to fight the war in Ukraine.
There are consequences, and consequences that we often don't see or don't fully realize until after things are already taking place. Because Europe, right, not surprisingly, as the article points out, a number of our largest European allies are pressuring the United States to wrap up these negotiations quickly on a deal with Iran. Because why? Well, because they don't want to be buying the oil from Russia, right? It's like, yeah, we're sending, as we talked about, possibly north of $800 million a day to Russia, which, guess what? That helps them fight the war in Ukraine, right? That type of money makes a difference. So if they were at least able to even cut back on that more, that would be helpful. So they're saying, hey, we got to get a deal done, right, with Iran. And Iran's like, well, hey, now we got some leverage, right, because you guys want this, so we need these things. And we've got some Americans that we're holding hostage, so we've got that as well. And I mean, so it's a mess, and not continuing to not more aggressively address the situation in Ukraine with Russia's invasion, I think, is only going to continue to build issues like this, where you're going to end up with, instead of, Putin and North Korea and Iran as recalcitrant, you're going to develop new powers that are that way because they don't see any repercussions. They don't see, the type of full force and might response that would deter them from doing these sorts of things. It's like, I'm going to be stubborn as hell because it looks like people can get away with that. Putin can be recalcitrant all day and all night, anytime he wants. And I mean, he gets sanctioned. But again, if you're Iran and if you're North Korea, you're already being sanctioned. You already are hurting economically. Your people are already starving or under persecution, the threat of death. So are sanctions really the thing that are going to stop you? If they were, wouldn't you already have stopped? We've been sanctioning North Korea for how long? We've been sanctioning Iran for how long? It doesn't appear to have stopped them. North Korea has a nuclear weapon that can launch and hit the United States. And Iran has enriched uranium to the point of being able to develop a nuclear weapon. So the case for sanctions, Lance, I don't know. Just being a simple person, it seems to me that they're not, highly effective at preventing recalcitrant individuals and powers from just doing what they want anyway. That's what it seems.
Did you go for the grand slam in the bottom of the ninth there?
I did.
To win the game?
I did.
Okay. Well, the whole point of this, though, folks, right, is we have a mission here at True Chat, and that's to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And I would challenge you, where else in your reading or watching of the news have you seen anybody put these three things together? That's, I think, something that we haven't seen that we put together for you here today. And I think it's a very good conversation to have, if for no other reason to realize the broader spectrum of issues that are caused by this war between Ukraine and Russia. It's not that simple. There are all these other things that are going on. And to Justin's point, possibly even some that we haven't seen yet that we'll see in the future because of this. So it's a much bigger picture, and we've brought it to you. And hopefully when you have your conversations with your family and friends, you can bring this up and they say, well, where are you getting this cutting edge information? And you can say, well, it's this podcast, and you can find them on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found. And we can all start to have this conversation and try to solve some of these problems that nobody else in the news media really seems to be talking about.
So, Lance, we had that conversation for these reasons. I think it's a great value proposition, and people can listen to The State of Us on Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast, first thing in the mornings. They can also hear us on AM and FM radio stations across the country. We'd encourage you to invite your friends to participate because, again, where else are you finding things like this? And, let us know your thoughts on today's program. Send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org. We'd like to hear from you. So what's do we have a victor, Lance, on the word of the day?
Well, I think it was you. I think it was like 6-5. I mean, I was way ahead, and then you ran the clock out and stalled as you hit your grand slam home run in the bottom of the ninth to win the well-played game. And I'm impressed because you used a word 4 times, or a 4-syllable word multiple times.
And managed to use it correctly, too.
Right. And notice how
after the first stumble of not being able to say it correctly.
And I took that one away from you. But, when you hit that grand slam home run in the bottom of the ninth as you were holding the ball to stall for the last shot.
Bases are loaded.
Yeah. Notice how I combined 2 sports there, basketball and baseball.
That's all right.
The 2 sports analogies allowed you to pull out a well-earned victory.
For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.